大家好，欢迎来到可视化与可视分析国际学术报告第17期。本次的特约讲者是德国斯图加特大学 Daniel Weiskopf，他是可视化研究中心 VIS 的教授和联席主任，也是可视化和交互系统研究所 VIS 的执行主任。他于2001年获得图宾根大学物理学博士学位。2005年获得斯图加特大学计算机科学教授资格认证。他的研究兴趣包括可视化、可视分析、眼动、跟踪、人机交互、计算机图形学、增强与虚拟现实及狭义与广义相对论。它是由德国科学基金 DFG 资助的合作研究中心 SFB Transregio 161的可视化计算定量方法的发言人。该中心涵盖了可视化的基础研究，其中包括今天要涉及的多维可视化。Okay, so without further ado, let Daniel take the time and give us this talk on multidimensional data visual analysis.
So, thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you also for having me here in this lecture series. Let me try to start my screen sharing. Just a second. All right, and I hope that you can see the slides in full screen. Is that correct?
Yeah, yes. I can.
Yeah, okay. All right, then let's get started. So welcome to my presentation on visual analysis of multidimensional data. Thanks for having me in your lecture series here. So the idea of my talk is to present some of the work that I've been doing in this area together with many collaborators. I should also say this is a huge field of research with a long history. We'll see a few examples of that in a second. But this also means that my talk is not meant to be comprehensive in any means. So it's more focusing on some perspectives of my own, and it's also focusing on presenting some of my own work, rather than trying to cover much work of many, many other people that have been doing research in this area. All right, so with this, let me start with a little bit of introduction by showing some examples. And the first one that we're seeing here is that we have a lot of examples of multidimensional visualization, and you've seen many of those yourself before. And many of them are well known in statistical graphics and InfoVis. And here on the right, we have a very simple example. So this is a typical scatter plot showing data points living in two data dimensions. So if one data dimension here, the other data dimension here. So a little bit more advanced is this example here to the bottom right, where we have parallel coordinates as another typical representative of multidimensional data visualization. So we have the data axes here as vertical axes, and the data points actually are not drawn as points, but as polylines that cross through the different axes here. But still, both examples are showing rather lower dimensional data spaces. Therefore, let's have a look at another example here. And this shows data that comes from a high dimensional space. And the high dimensional space here represents the hidden states of LSTM layers of a trained machine learning model. And now, how do we arrive at a 2D visualization? Well, it's produced by reducing the dimensionality to 2D. And here I'm just employing t-SNE to do so. And on top of that, we see one trajectory that's being highlighted. So this is a trajectory while we're processing this language model through a given sentence that's being analyzed. And so this is an example that illustrates a rather complex application, you could argue, of high dimensional data visualization. And this specific example would be helpful, for example, for fostering explainable AI. Yet another example that comes a little bit more from the scientific visualization application area. And in particular, this example, it's from astrophysics. So the data set, the underlying data set is from the 2019 CSIG-VIS contest. And here we try to understand structure formation in cosmic evolution. And also here, the data set comes with several data attributes. And for example, you see a SPLOM here, so a collection of different scatter plot matrices showing various data dimensions. And the same type of data set is also shown here in a small parallel coordinates visualization here at the top. Good. Yet another, my last example for this intro is yet showing another type of complex data set. And in particular, what we're seeing here is data that comes from an eye tracking experiments, in this case with 15 participants. And now we want to compare or be able to compare the scan paths. And now these scan paths, from my terminology, can be considered as to be data points living in high dimensional space. And on the right, that's the interesting part here, you essentially see the different scan paths. So these are represented by these bigger glyphs here, the gaze spirals, and they're living in the two-dimensional space. And how is this two-dimensional space produced? Well, it comes again from a projection. In this case, it's being done by UMAP. So we have the high-dimensional data. These are the scan paths. Each of them is treated as this high-dimensional data point, and the center location is being projected down by this UMAP technique. You can also do a little bit data drill down. So we have two clusters, like this cluster here of two scan paths. They are highlighted here again, a little bit bigger, so people can actually try to analyze the underlying scan path. And you can see, or imagine at least, that there's quite some data sitting there. Actually, we see frames from an underlying stimulus here. So what this shows that we can actually combine typical multidimensional data visualization with this rather generic technique that comes from UMAP with something that's very application specific. And here, in this case, these would be these gaze spirals designed specifically for eye tracking data. All right, so with all of these examples, I've already demonstrated that multidimensional data is almost everywhere. So you find it in many, many different applications. And therefore, we also have this to be treated as a rather quite generic problem. And because of this wide usefulness and relevance, but also because it's touching so many different fields, there are many techniques already available. And therefore, we're looking back at the very, very long history of multidimensional data analysis and visualization. And it should also be noted that the topic is not restricted to the visualization community. There are many contributions and influences from many other disciplines, in particular from statistics. And despite the maturity of the field, I would argue that there's still much ongoing research with great new developments. And with my talk, I want to discuss a few of these new techniques that we've developed in the context of my research group and collaborations in the last recent years. All right, since I don't have enough time to cover the topic in a rather comprehensive fashion, I want to give you a little bit of background reading, some pointers if you want to dig a little bit further into the topic. And the first one here, this provides a rather quick overview and some historical remarks. And you notice it's already from the year 1997. And even back then, we could, or they could look back at 30 years of research in the field. The other references provide additional surveys of the field. For example, here we have a classification and overview of different techniques. And here we have a summary from the perspective of scientific data visualization. And at the bottom, you find a rather recent survey with an update of different techniques. But also this list of survey papers is by no means meant to be comprehensive. So with this, let me come back to the actual talk of mine. And here's an outline of the rest of my talk. So I want to start with a conceptual mathematical model. And this will help me structure my talk and bring some kind of order into the various visualization techniques. And then I will discuss some visualization strategies on a rather overview level, along with some examples from my own work. And the next parts will cover a few techniques in more detail. And here I will describe how we can visualize certain correlation patterns and how we can build a link between domain and image. And this includes a special treatment of multidimensional domains. And it also includes the discussion of continuous statistical plots. And I will also briefly touch on user studies to evaluate multidimensional visualization. And here I will also include some results from our eye tracking studies and work in eye tracking. And finally, I want to wrap up my talk by providing some thoughts about future research directions and how the field could develop. So, all right, now let's have a little bit closer look at multidimensional visualization. And as indicated, I would like to start with a conceptual level to guide the discussion. And here I'd like to adopt a quite simple mathematical model to describe the visualization problem at this conceptual level. And this model is not new, it's been used frequently in the literature before. And it essentially boils down to a function or a map f that's at the center of this discussion. And this map takes us from a space U here on the left-hand side to another space V here on the right-hand side. And the space U, that could be just considered the domain, or you could also see it as containing the independent variables. In contrast, the space V can be considered as the codomain of the function, and this contains the dependent variables. Okay, again, the important point is that we have this map and we have the two spaces, U and V. And now I'd like to see the conceptual model in action. And to this end, let's take our very first, still very simple example. It's just a function f that takes us from real numbers, x, that's the domain, to real numbers y in the codomain. And of course, this is not yet multidimensional because both the domain and the codomain are obviously just one-dimensional. But nevertheless, it's a good starting point to motivate what we could do with a visualization. And that is here with a function plot in this case. For example, we can visually do the mapping from a parameter x, which we choose here, just going upward, to the corresponding function value y over here. And of course, you can also go the other way around. If you are given a function value y here, you go here and you can identify the corresponding x value. You can also do the same for whole intervals of parameters and map them. But you can also essentially do something like sensitivity analysis. For example, by looking at the slope. Here we have a high slope. Here the slope is very small. And you can also easily identify extrema like this maximum value here and the minimum value here. And of course, there are many, many more things that you can do with this simple but very effective type of visualization. But of course, there's this big shortcoming. This function plot works only so well for the mapping from one-dimensional space U to one-dimensional space V. So in other words, we're not yet at this case of multidimensional visualization. And that's really the big thing now for the rest of my talk. And when we want to switch to the case of multidimensional visualization, we obviously need to include higher dimensionality. And now let's take a model where this space U has dimensionality m, and we can also assume that the whole thing lives in Cartesian coordinates. Therefore, we call it Rm. And also, likewise, for space V, we assume that we can describe it by Cartesian space, and here the dimensionality is called n. And of course, the big question is, how can we deal with m larger 1 and or with n larger 1? And the problem is that we can't just directly adopt the idea of the function plot from the previous slide. After all, in this case, there's just not enough space, visual space available to extend the function plot idea from the previous slide to this new scenario. Now, before I start addressing this in a little bit more detail, a few words on the terminology that I'm using. So usually the term multidimensional refers to the higher dimensionality of the input. So in our case, in my language, that's the space U. And in contrast, the term multivariate is typically used to describe the output or the space V. However, I won't necessarily make this distinction here in my talk. We'll see that very often you're just interested in one of the spaces, and therefore I might also just use the term multidimensional to describe the characteristics of the output and the input alike. And so we can deal with the dependent variables and the independent variables on the same footing. So another term that's directly related is that of multi-field data. And that means that we have several fields attached to the same domain. Or in other words, we have several data attributes attached. And this can also be seen just as a multidimensional space, V in our language. And this way, this also falls into our conceptual model. And finally, I'm typically assuming real valued parameters and data. But other kinds of spaces or different kind of data types are also possible as well. For example, you could work with categorical or nominal data, or you could try to apply the whole problem setting to ordinal data. Now, with this conceptual model at hand, and also our mathematical model that we have in place, I now want to go and look into different visualization strategies, and I also want to briefly categorize them. So to give a little bit of order into the big range and set of different techniques that's available. And here is an overview of the strategies. And here I also should say that this is not a comprehensive list, and it might also slightly differ from other categorizations that you might find in the literature. And so it should be taken with this little bit sort of grain, and it should be understood that it rather reflects my own perspectives and my own priorities on how I would like to categorize the whole zoo of different visualization techniques. Okay, with this little disclaimer, we can go and look at an overview of the different categories that are available to do multidimensional data visualization. First, we can ignore parts of the full model to simplify the problem. Or we can try to increase the number of visual channels or variables to show the data. Or we can lower the dimensionality of the involved spaces. And there's the option to do multiplexing of visual information. And of course, human interaction and exploration can help as well. And finally, we can extract relevant information before we apply the visualization, just to simplify this later step of visualization. And what's also important, all of these approaches do not necessarily exclude each other. In fact, very often we want to combine them and take the best of several worlds from the different strategies. All right, so after this introduction, let's have a look at some of these categories, and I'd like to kind of illustrate how they work. So here's the first one. So here the idea is that the full model will be reduced by ignoring parts. And just for completeness, the full model is repeated here just one more time. And now we just want to simplify the visualization problem, as I said, by removing parts of the model. And a quite common approach just gets rid of the domain U and the explicit function description. And then you just need to visualize the image of this functions in space V over here. In other words, you just need now enough visualization space to show the codomain, but you don't need visualization space to show the domain or the function itself. So, typical example, if you have a field of two attributes living in 3D space, then you would just need to show the data values with the two attributes in a 2D scatter plot. And you could completely ignore things like how you could do a volume rendering or similar. Now, this approach very often includes sampling. And here I'm using our case of the unit function again, just for illustration. And now here we place a number of samples on the function, as you see it here. And I have chosen an equidistant sampling along the domain X here. And then we can actually remove the function. And in the final step, we ignore the X parameter of the samples. So after this, the samples just sit here on the Y-axis. And of course, we don't need the X domain anymore in this case. So I can remove that. And this means that we're just left with the codomain. And we can still see quite some information about the data set here. From the varying density of the dots, we can infer indirectly what's happened on the function. But of course, this happens only indirectly because we did the sampling before. And I used this simple example of a 1D function, 1D to 1D, but of course, this whole process also works for any kind of dimensionality, not just for the simple case of the univariate functions. And it also shows that there is not such a clear difference between domain and codomain, or between multidimensional or multivariate data, as I discussed before. So after all, we just have a collection of data items that are left in space V here on the left-hand side. It should also be said that it's important that this approach is not just a simplification method. In fact, very often we don't even know the space U or the explicit description of the function f. In fact, quite often we are just provided with sampled data in data space V in the first place. And this is another reason why this approach is quite common in multidimensional visualization. And many of my next examples of techniques exactly work in this V space of data values. Now, another strategy wants to crank up the available dimensionality of the visualization design space. So far, I've just assumed a 2D visualization space with the two channels that hold the X and Y location of visual marks or patterns. And of course, our visual perception can work with more than only these two dimensions. For example, we can go to embed the visualization in 3D space, essentially making use of the additional depth dimension. Unfortunately, there are many perceptual problems associated with 3D renderings. Here on the right, you see a typical example of a 3D scatter plot. And here we try to kind of mitigate some of these problems. You can see a little bit of the shading, the illumination here. In this case, we try to explore different kinds of illumination models, including ones that work with different types of codimensions of the embedded space or within the embedded space. So in this specific case, we have codimension 2 illumination superimposed on top of this 3D scatter plot representation. Now, this is just one example. Other approaches might use additional visual channels or retinal variables, just like color hue or brightness. And yet another approach might just blend several visualizations on top of each other. And quite often, this is applied to multi-field data, where you take the different layers and you blend them together. But this overall strategy has also a number of issues and shortcomings. So first, it has limited scalability for increasing data dimensionality, because of course there are limits to our visual perception. And second, care has to be taken that the additional visualization dimensions can be perceived effectively. And third, interaction might become harder with such a visualization. For example, if you would like to pick elements in 3D space, that's much harder than doing a similar operation or task support in 2D space. Now, another strategy takes the opposite perspective. Now let's lower the dimensionality of the data that we want to visualize. And one class of techniques does some kind of geometric projection, if you will. And for example, you might just choose a 2D subspace that's spanned by 2 Cartesian coordinate axes. And then you could project onto the subspace, typically just by removing all the other higher dimensional data coordinates. So it's kind of this orthographic projection on the subspace. And after this, you may just directly apply a typical 2D scatter plot. Another example is CSIG-VIS. And you see an example, a typical example here on the right-hand side. So what we have is a number of data items that are being projected on this 2D space. What's good about CSIG-VIS is that you kind of have still anchors left of the original kind of data dimensions, and they are shown here by these representative dots at the surrounding of the circular region. And it's kind of a radial type of projection, or the final visualization looks like a radial projection. And this use case here, or where we applied it, the data set came from software engineering. You have several data metrics, software quality metrics that are being used, attached to the data values, and then the data points are being projected. So that's just one type of class of techniques. Other type of techniques employ some kind of dimensionality reduction. It could be a linear one, a nonlinear dimensionality reduction. And typical examples are things like PCA, MDS, t-SNE, UMAP, you name it. And these techniques are in general data-driven, and they try to find a good representation of the dimensional or the multidimensional data points now then in the projected lower dimensional visualization space, where you try to embed the data. And this is also the usual way to go if you have very high dimensional data in the first place, because this whole approach typically scales quite well with increasing dimensionality. And that makes it different from many of the other multidimensional data visualization techniques that are not that well scalable with increasing number of dimensions. But of course, a problem of all of these dimensionality reduction techniques is that they don't show the semantics of the original data dimensions anymore. In contrast, the orthographic projections onto subspaces that I mentioned earlier keep at least the axes of the subspace. But on the other hand, they have the disadvantage that they don't show the other dimensions. So an overall overarching problem of all approaches is that we might lose quite some important information from the original data from this data reduction or the projection methods. One approach to address exactly this problem of information loss is to combine several different projections to obtain a more complete picture of the data set. Essentially, you could argue, look at the data set from different perspectives to get this more comprehensive view on the data. And this leads me to the strategy of multiplexing. For example, we can place several lower dimensional representations next to each other. And the scatter plot matrix is a typical example of this approach. It does kind of a systematic combination of all pairs of data dimensions and then places the resulting scatter plots into a matrix organization. And in this example of this SPLOM or scatter plot matrix, we tried to visualize different types of characteristic values that try to measure workload data from different computing systems. And I should also note that there are advanced multiplexing opportunities in visualization, not only here, but in general. And notably, Min Chen published a very nice paper some years ago about this at CSIG-VIS. I should say that here in my talk, I adopt a rather straightforward approach. We mostly want to do a spatial composition, for example, by just placing the individual visualizations side by side, as we have it here in this SPLOM examples. Other examples besides this SPLOM that we're seeing here are parallel coordinates, which essentially place axes after axes next to each other in the visualization. But you can also do other approaches like hierarchical composition as in dimensional stacking. Of course, the big problem of multiplexing is that of scalability. After all, we need more space to fit more of the individual visualizations for the increasing dimensionality in this case. Another typical way of improving visualization is by supporting interactive exploration. And very often this might include selection and highlighting. And the image here on the right shows a simple but typical example. We have highlighted with 3 different colors, something on the first axis. And for example, with the red lines, you can see how the data values kind of propagate to the other data dimensions. So you can easily follow from this highlighting and color coding how the data ranges go from axis to axis, meaning from data dimension to data dimension. But of course, you can also do more than this simple selection. Here's an example that we did for navigation support in 3D SPLOMs. So you have a 3D SPLOM visualization here, and you have a 3D scatter plot here. And you can imagine this is much harder to navigate than for the 2D case. For the 2D case, there are techniques like rolling the dice available. We tried to adopt them, and we worked on an adapted type of support that supported the corresponding navigation in this 3-dimensional variant of the SPLOM. But there are more examples as well, because interaction plays a very important role in visual analytics systems in general. And here you can see a typical example that we took from our work in bioinformatics. And in this specific example, visual analysis is being used to analyze biochemical reaction networks. And this example also shows that the system will not only have the typical multidimensional visualizations like the scatter plot here, but it will do multi-view, coordinated multi-view visualization, for example, also showing something like this graph or network visualization here, and many other visualization views. And this type of diagram here shows a quite comprehensive framework that we developed for describing the interaction with dimensionality reduction on a generic level. And I'm not going into detail here. I'd just like to point out that the interactions should be supported with the various stages of the whole analysis process. So it's not just the visualization, but you also have to look at all the different other stages like data selection, here we have feature selection, parameter tuning, and so on. And of course, everything is embedded in this whole circular process that includes the human user, human in the loop, by respective interaction techniques. And the final kind of strategy that I'd like to briefly touch on is that we can try to extract patterns, features, or some kind of relevant characteristics of the data by employing some kind of computer-based data pre-processing, data analysis before we actually go into the visualization. And so the usual goal is that we would like to reduce the amount of information shown, or that we want to be able to highlight important parts. And this example here shows a visualization by so-called cluster flow parallel coordinates. And here the underlying data set shows the electric power production according to primary energy sources in Germany. And so you have the different data axes for the different types of data sources or energy sources here. And here, on top of the regular parallel coordinates, we applied clustering in several 2D subspaces. And you see bundled curves, and the curve bundling allows us to visualize the clusters within the parallel coordinates plot. And this essentially allows us to follow kind of the flow of the data items between clusters at adjacent pairs of axes. And that means at adjacent pairs of subspaces, 2D subspaces, if you will. However, this is only just one example of how we could extract information for multidimensional data analysis and visualization. On the next few slides, I want to go now into much more detail for just some other feature extraction highlighting techniques. Yes, let me start with this. I would like to start with identifying local linear correlation. And I would like to show how we can make use of that information within parallel coordinates and scatter plots. So in short, the feature that we are interested here is the feature of linear correlation that we find in a local fashion. All right. Before we start with this, let me first provide you a little bit of background information. And this is about the point-line duality in parallel coordinates. And let's assume that we're working in the simple case of just 2D space. And we want to understand the relationship between a typical scatter plot that you see here on the left and the parallel coordinates visualization that you see here on the right. Okay. Let's start by just placing one data item into the scatter plot here. We have that here. And this maps to a corresponding straight line in parallel coordinates. So we have one data dimension here, and you can read it off. This gives this position. We have the other data dimension here, and we have a 0 value here that corresponds to this location on this axis. So you have this location, you just draw a straight line. Okay, this is how you would map a data point in a scatter plot to the corresponding parallel coordinates visualization. And what we can do now is, of course, just one data item is a little bit boring. We can add more. And you can see that I didn't just arbitrarily choose data points. I specifically chose them that they're sitting on this kind of straight line over here. So in other words, in the scatter plot, they bring in a perfect linear correlation. And the interesting thing is, if you look at the parallel coordinates plot over here, that they cross all at one point here. So the perfect linear correlation over here gives rise to this one common intersection point in parallel coordinates. This is a very important visual pattern for us because this indicates linear correlation in parallel coordinates, if you see something like this. The interesting thing is that we also can go the backward direction. So if we have a point here, that corresponds to a line over here. And that's the basic idea of point-line duality. Point in one domain corresponds to a line in the other domain. And that goes for scatter plot to parallel coordinates, but also the other way around, from parallel coordinates to scatter plots. Okay, so that's some basic geometric considerations for the relationship between these two types of diagrams or plots. Now, we've just seen that the parallel coordinates provide a very clear visual pattern for the linear correlations. But there are also some problems that are still remaining, and one comes with positive correlation. So here on the right, you see a typical example of a positive correlation as shown in the scatter plot. And if you do the corresponding parallel coordinates plot, you still see an intersection point, but the intersection point is now outside this pair of axes. And this causes a big problem because usually parallel coordinates are drawn in the way that you only draw the interior between this pair of axes, because you need the space for the following adjacent axes if you want to do multidimensional data visualization. So in other words, it's very hard to perceive these intersection points because they're not actually drawn. So you have to infer just from this visual information here. So what can we do about that? And the question is, can we kind of highlight these correlation features regardless of whether they are positive or negative correlations? And of course, you don't ask these questions if you don't have at least a partial solution. And the basic idea is as follows. So we want to have a specific support for visualizing these linear correlations in parallel coordinates. And all the details you can find here in the underlying paper if you're interested in some of the backgrounds of the technique. But let's turn to the basic idea now. So first, what we want to do is we find the linear correlation in the original space. That means between the data items, you could view that as the space of the scatter plot. And of course, this is kind of our automatic information extraction because the computer system can easily do that. Then we consider the linear correlation as a line in the scatter plot, and therefore we can map it to a point in the parallel coordinates. And we keep the points whether they are inside, that means for negative correlation, or outside this pair of axes. So we don't care about that. In any case, we keep these points and we will use them in our later stages of visualization. And finally, we also might use the correlation strength for later filtering or highlighting, because here we have a very clear signal of linear correlation. In some cases, this local neighborhood where you find a linear correlation might be not that pronounced, and then you might want to filter away this respective point. All right, so that's the basic idea, and that works for the 2D scatter plot mapped to two axes that represent two data dimensions in parallel coordinates. But I don't want to stop just here. I don't just want to show the correlation between two data dimensions. And here really the beauty and power of parallel coordinates come into play, because their geometry allows for more than just looking at two data dimensions together. In fact, with the geometry of parallel coordinates in the background, we can do more. We can generalize our correlation points to the general form of so-called indexed points for so-called p-flats. And here the p stands for the dimensionality of the flat geometry that's embedded in multidimensional space. And here at the bottom, you see a typical example of that. So that's our kind of 3D scatter plot. And here we have the corresponding parallel coordinates plot. And let's have a look a little bit what we're seeing here. So we can kind of draw three different data points that are sitting on this 2-flat, on this plane that's embedded in the 3D scatter plot. So we have this blue point here, P2, and that corresponds to this blue line over here, holy line in parallel coordinates. Likewise, for the red dot, we have this holy line over here. And for the black dot, P3, we have this polyline here. Okay, so that's this direct mapping. Now we can do our trick from the previous slide that we would like to identify what happens to a linear correlation or a straight line here. We could, for example, take the line spanned by P2 and P1, meaning the blue and the red point. And you just look at the intersection points. So we have an intersection point here between the red and the blue curve, and we have another intersection point here. And likewise, you can do it for this line that's spanned by P3 and P1. So the black and the red line or point, you see the corresponding points over here. And they also give these intersection points. These would be the index points that represent just the relationship along the line. Now you can combine all of these intersection points and find yet another intersection point in between. And that's a representation now of the whole two-flat. Okay, so in some way you could argue that what we've done is that you can recursively build index points. You start from the original data points, then you take two of those, you find linear correlation that gives the one index points. If you do combinations of those, that gives rise to the two index points. And you can imagine that this not just stops at the two-flat. You could go to an arbitrary p-flat. But in our case, we stop there because for most of the visualization applications, it's good enough and complex enough already if you try to understand kind of this flat behavior between three data dimensions. So how does this now work in this whole process? Of course, one of the remaining things is that we have to find the local linear correlations. And that's, in our case, done in the following way. What we do, we first find the k nearest neighbor around a data point. Then we put that into a PCA. So it's kind of a local PCA built according to these k nearest neighbors. And once you've done the PCA, you do the eigenanalysis, and that gives rise now to the different eigendirections. And combined, they can be visualized as this ellipsoid here. And you see the main direction of spread here, also indicated by this plane. And what you can do now is that at the final step, you would like to visualize not the local linear correlation in the full high dimensional space, but you want to look at it from, let's say, the one flat or the two flat perspective. So you could project it down to the respective subspaces. And here in this example, we just projected it down to the subspace spanned by x1 and x2. And this gives us this linear correlation here. And this can then just directly be used to do the visualization. All right. The overall process looks like this. If you look at the full pipeline, so we start with the data input points over here. They live in m-dimensional space, in the original space. Then we find the k nearest neighbors, or maybe some ball of a finite size that you might have specified. And these are then plugged into a PCA computation. That's our local PCA that gives rise to these eigenvalues that are still all living in m-dimensional data space. And then you restrict them to your lower dimensional spaces where you want to do the visualization. And that means you fit your p-flats to those. And then you just draw the representations, these point representations for the one flats and two flats in the usual space that are using for the parallel coordinates. All right. So now with this process at hand and the basic mathematical idea also at hand, I want to show a few examples to illustrate how this whole thing works and how we can interpret the resulting visualizations. And let's start with a simple example here. So what we have here is three data attributes, 0, 1, 2. And this is a typical regular parallel coordinates plot. What you can see is that you get a little bit of an impression what's going on with the data values, but it's very hard to understand what's actually happening in terms of correlations. And I should note that here we don't yet have our new p-flats visualizations in place. And so now let's switch it on. And I still have in the background the original parallel coordinates visualization in gray, but now in blue and in this orange type of color, we've overlaid the representative visualizations of the index points. And you can make that even clearer by zooming in. So what you can see here is that there is kind of this cluster of points highlighting some kind of correlation for the blue pair of attributes and another one for the orange one. And here I should say these are showing the relationship between two data dimensions. So these are the one index points for the one flats. And it's for the blue one, it's between attribute 1 and attribute 2, and for the orange one, it's between attribute 0 and attribute 1. And here we can even do some kind of brushing, that we want to look at those examples and highlight these in the corresponding scatter plot. And then in this case, you can kind of confirm the relationship. So we have for the blue one that sits within these axes, so that has to be a negative correlation. You can easily kind of confirm that we have this negative correlation here in the scatter plot as well. Here for this orange yellowish one, this sits to the right-hand side of this axis pair here. So obviously it has to be a positive correlation. We can also confirm this positive correlation in this corresponding scatter plot. Of course, this was kind of a simple example. Now, here's a more realistic example. Here we have this one flat visualization applied to the famous wine quality data set, where we have several data dimensions collected. And again, we have in the background the grayscale visualization of the regular parallel coordinates. But on top of that, we have by color coding the different one flat visualization by using index points. And now I'm zooming in for one example here. So we have the blue highlighted points here, and they correspond to the corresponding pattern, in this case between alcohol and density, that you see in this wine quality data set. So that was an example for the one flats, but we can also go to the two flats with this visualization. So here's the two flat visualization, where we also have the color coding of the two flat representations. Again, we can zoom in a little bit to see more examples. And there seems to be a little bit of a technical issue. Sorry, I skipped over that, but I don't want to go back. There seems to be a little bit of an issue with this visual representation. So what I would like to switch over now is that what we've just seen is an example where we essentially looked at local linear correlation identification. We saw that this is useful for the parallel coordinates visualization directly. And also we saw some representation in the related scatter plots. But now the obvious question is, can we also combine it with the other strategy that I explained earlier? That means with dimensionality reduction, just like MDS, TSNE, and so on. And so what we'd like to do is we'd like to keep this pipeline that we had before, where we essentially have direction information, vector information. We'd like to keep that pipeline, but we would like to kind of marry it or merge it with the dimensionality reduction of data points. So the usual process here is that you have the m-dimensional data space. You do a projection or dimensionality reduction using TSNE, PCA, and so on, and that gives you data locations. So the question is, can we use this directional information, the vector information that we know from the local PCA, and kind of overlay that on top of the dimensionality reduction that gives us the final 2D visualization? So what we'd like to have is this result here, where we not only have points living in the dimensionality reduced space, but we want to have points and the directions that show kind of this main local correlation information attached to the different points. So the big question is, how can we compute this? And the problem is really boils down, if you would like to say, how can we transform the vectors or directions through the dimensionality reduction process? The background information can be found in this paper up here if you want to do a little bit of background reading. So what we assume is that the dimensionality reduction is kind of a black box for us. So it's kind of a mapping, pi, that works on the points P that takes us from the high dimensional space to the two-dimensional visualization space. And so we have these points P here, and they're mapped over to lowercase p in the 2D visualization space. Now, that's the regular dimensionality reduction. What we do on top of that now is that we assume that we have vector informations here, and those come from the local PCA. And the big question is, what happens to these vectors, V1, V2, V3, after the kind of projection process? Let's assume that we actually know this mapping pi, then it's pretty easy. Well, we map the points to points. This is just applying the mapping pi. And for direction information, you just need the first partial derivatives. So you take the first partial derivatives of this mapping with respect to the coordinates in the original space and apply them to the incoming vectors that are living in the high dimensional space. And that gives us the vector direction after the kind of application of the dimensionality reduction. Now, the big problem is we usually don't have an explicit formulation of this mapping pi. There are some exceptions. If you do PCA, that's easy. It's the linear operation. Then all of these partial derivatives are constant. They are directly or can be directly derived from the PCA matrix. But for the typical nonlinear dimensionality reduction techniques, that's not possible. And so we have to do more. And what we can do is, well, we could do something like a numerical approximation, something like forward, central, or backward differences applied to kind of evaluations of this function pi. But that's not very accurate. It's also kind of time consuming. So the question is, can we do better than this explicit numerical approximation of the partial derivatives? And our observation is the following. To do this kind of implicit vector transformation, our observation is the following, that usually the function f, or we can associate a function, a cost function f, with any kind of dimensionality reduction that is useful, in the sense that we assume that the dimensionality reduction did find a good representation of our point set in the 2D space. That means that there is some underlying cost function that this whole dimensionality reduction process wants to kind of optimize for. With this, we can directly see that if we apply this partial derivatives, that this has to vanish. So this comes just from this assumption. So that's our basic assumption. But this is the key feature why we can now do an implicit derivation or computation of the partial derivatives, because now we can apply the implicit function theory and we can directly compute these unknowns that we want to compute. And essentially it's based on this idea that we have the chain rule applied to this multidimensional setting. And so here is the full formulation written down. And from this, we can arrive at these partial derivatives. And then these give rise to our projection operation, essentially taking the vector information from the original high dimensional space now to the low dimensional space. So for the final visual representation, we just take these vectors, we build essentially a glyph that shows the main directions and in a smooth fashion. And this shows a way where the linear correlation is heading or pointing towards after we applied the embedding or projection with the dimensionality reduction technique. And just for illustration, some examples. Here we have the original MDS where we just have the point cloud. And here we have the same data set attached now with vector information. And you have a little bit of a zoom in here. Let's have a look at this one here. So this zooms into this area here. If you were just to look at the original representation here, you would not be able to see that this point here, this elongated point, kind of not belongs to this kind of line of points over here. Because geometry-wise, they are sitting kind of the same type of line. So you could do kind of visual continuity and infer that this point here belongs to the rest of the points. But now taking into account our vector information, we clearly see that this behaves differently because it has this elongated direction as opposed to the other ones that seem to work together. And by zooming into or looking at the original data set, the COIL data set, we in fact see that these little ducks and this one, they behave similarly, and this is kind of an outlier. Of course, we can see that by looking at the original data, but the key message here is that we can already see that by including this vector information in this implicit fashion here in this type of visualization. So what this tells us is that it's really a great feature to take a little bit more information from the high dimensional space and kind of wire it through the whole visualization pipeline here all the way until the end of the dimensionality reduction. All right. Let me now switch to a slightly different topic. And here I want to discuss the linking between the domain or to the domain in a little bit more detail. And again, the idea is that we want to be able to understand a multidimensional domain. And so here I'd like to include the information about the domain as well. And the problem is that it's not just a univariate function, but a multidimensional type of mapping that takes us from a multidimensional domain U to another domain. And to be able to make this problem tractable, the question really is, how can we reduce the dimensionality of the domain? And this is really the starting point for the next steps. And the basic idea is that we would like to adopt the approach of space-filling curves. And here on the right, you see two typical examples of one typical representative of a space-filling curve. Here it's a Hilbert curve, and we have two different orders, so coarser and a little bit more fine-grained level. This is just one example. In general, a space-filling curve should cover the whole space, and it's still a 1D curve. And in this way, we essentially have a mapping from the original MD space, which is covered by the space-filling curve, back to just one data dimension or description dimension that goes along the curve. And of course, the key feature is, the key thing is that we should consider is that we have to carefully choose the space-filling curve. In particular, we want to be able to keep the distances from the original space as best as possible. And now, on the next few slides, I want to discuss this approach in a little bit more detail. For background reading, here is the underlying paper. And as indicated on the previous slide, it's really key that we choose the right type of space-filling curve. And let's just have a look at the 2D example for illustrating the problem setting. So on the left here, we see a typical scalar field shown on the 2D domain. And a first approach takes a scan line to fill the space. And the color coding here indicates the order along the curve. So from top to bottom, we have this kind of progressing order. And at the bottom image, we see along the curve, we see the data values. And what you see is that the data values are jumping up and down at a very, very high frequency. So this is not a very good mapping. In fact, the spatial neighborhoods are completely destroyed because the scan line jumps from one side to the other. It keeps on jumping. So you have to do something better here. And in fact, the space-filling curve using the Hilbert curve does a much better job. So if you look at the distribution of the data values along the curve, you see already that this gives a much better result. But you also see that there are still some breaks. So there are kind of these little spaces in between. Although this whole data set is rather compact, it's kind of still split apart a little bit along the Hilbert curve. And you also see that here because some of the features are cutting through, or you're cutting through this feature here with a Hilbert curve. Therefore, we want to do even better than the Hilbert curve. And this is here with our new data-driven space-filling curve, we see the respective results. So you see that there's still a little bit of breakup, but overall, the data values are much more coherent along the curve now. And in fact, you also see why this is produced, this better result is produced, because the underlying data-driven space-filling curve doesn't cut through the feature. In fact, you see kind of the feature represented here in the space-filling curve corresponding to the feature over here. And we don't cut through the edges of the features. And that's the key observation here. So we want to arrive at such a data-driven space-filling curve to get a good coherent behavior representation along a 1D curve. You can also do this kind of on a quantitative fashion. So we have a pretty bad result when you look at autocorrelation of data values for the original scan line, which is this black curve here. It drops very quickly. So high means better. So this fast drop-off is pretty bad. For the Hilbert curve and the data-driven curve, we have much better results. But you see that the data-driven curve here in blue still is better than the Hilbert curve. So this tells a good story that including some behavior characteristics of the data, when you do or lay out your space-filling curve, gives you additional advantages. And of course, you can not only do this in 2D, you can also go to 3D. And here we have a typical 3D data set. If you do the scan line, you have the data distribution here for the Hilbert curve here, and for the our data-driven curves here, you get much better results. And here at the bottom, you see the corresponding layout of the curves. How can this be used in a typical visualization system? Here's an example where we show results of an SPH fluid simulation. So here is the spatial view of the fluid simulation. And here we are showing different data attributes. And here is, along the X direction, you see essentially the direction of our data-driven space filling curve. And you see highlighted here some areas that are then used by brushing linking to highlight certain features in the original three-dimensional SPH domain. What you can also see here is that this is actually a very nice example of multidimensional and multivariate data visualization at the same time, because we have a multidimensional kind of space where the data is living in. It's this three-dimensional space of the SPH simulation. And at the same time, we don't have a scalar field, a single scalar field just attached, but we have multivariate data attached to each of the SPH particles, and they can be shown side by side by these several curves here. And only because we could break down or reduce the dimensionality of the original domain to 1D, we are now able to essentially fit several of these multivariate curves next to each other and actually do some nice brushing and linking and interaction here. All right, so with this, I'd like to finish this part of the talk and switch over to how we can link the domain and the codomain. And so I essentially want to revisit this topic now from a different perspective, where I want to take into account sampling processes and reconstruction by using continuous plots. And as a quick reminder, the sampling played a big role in, or plays a big role in multidimensional visualization, because it allows us to keep some information of the function of the original domain, of the mapping from the original domain, even if we just look at the codomain. And for the univariate case, we saw that essentially you see these higher densities here, because a lot of these data points are essentially mapped to the same location. So indirectly, you see a little bit of the features of the function. But of course, this is a trivial, not so interesting case, and it's just meant to be a reminder of how the conceptual process works. So here's a more realistic example. What we have here is that we see two data attributes of in this case, of the Hurricane Isabel dataset. And what we see is pressure along this direction and temperature along this direction. And what we have here is a typical scatter plot. And actually, it's a scatter plot that encodes density of the samples by different color coding. The original domain is the simulation that has 3 spatial dimensions, and it's also data dependent. And how was the scatter plot produced? Well, we took samples on the spatial grid in a uniform fashion, and just like we did on the previous slides. And now, when you look at the scatter plot here, this looks really very interesting, because as an analyst, you might see, well, there are these cool features, patterns, so something's going on here of high interest. But there's really a problem. And the problem you see here, when we do the uniform sampling that was done on a very low resolution grid and increase the sampling rates, then we get more points in the scatter plot. And what you see is that these patterns kind of disappear. You still see them a little bit, but they get closer and closer. And you can imagine that if you increase the sampling rate even higher, eventually they will completely disappear. So the big message here is sampling is cool. It helps a lot, but also you have to be careful that you don't run into kind of patterns that are not associated with the original data set, but come only from certain sampling patterns. And that's actually the case here. So we essentially see sampling artifacts. And so you have to be careful that you don't misinterpret certain types of visualization just based on kind of sampling artifacts. And you could also see the problem from this perspective. So what we've taken so far is the following steps. So first, we sampled from the continuous data model. Then we reconstructed the plot, in our case, the scatter plot. And after that, a density version was produced. And this was our final visualization. So that's kind of a general observation how this process worked. And in cases like these, where we actually have access to the domain and the function that's given, we can actually do better. And in fact, we can do a shortcut. We can fully avoid the sampling and then the density construction just by employing a better visualization technique that takes the function directly into account. And this is meant to be a general concept, and I just want to illustrate it for this case of the scatter plots or the continuous scatter plots. And the background reading here is, again, the paper. So what we have is the following. So we have the domain here. Here in our case, it's a 3D domain. This is our codomain, the scatter plot, if you will. And we assume that we have a density here. S of u very often is just constant, or you might include some features here. And what's unknown is the density here on the right-hand side in the codomain. So we are searching for the sigma. And the basic observation is that if you integrate over a certain area here or region, and you look at the corresponding image of that region here in the codomain and integrate over the same region here with the unknown sigma, then both should be identical. It's kind of mass conservation, if you will. So this is what we are asking for. And from this, you can actually derive at the computation of the sigma. And here's the corresponding formula. Here's an illustration how this whole thing works. So here's just a simpler or lower dimensional version. So we have a point in the codomain. This is just a 1D codomain. And if you go backward, in this case, the original part that was mapped to this point here is actually a curve. So the inverse of a point in this case is a curve. And what you have to do is you have to look at this inverse image, the inverse of the image, and you have to integrate that over that. So in the general case, you would integrate over the inverse of the image, in our case, along this curve. And of course, you want to integrate over the incoming density, S of u, and you have to compensate for the effects that are introduced by the function f. And that's done by this volume element here in the denominator. And the integration domain is the co-dimensionality, m minus n of the whole thing. So in our case, it would be a 1D thing. And if you do that, not for 1D versus 2D, but for 2D versus 3D, in our case, for the continuous scatter plots, you get a result like this. So this shows exactly the same data as before, and only at the low sampling resolution. But although we have only very few samples, all these sampling artifacts are gone because we assumed this function model, a trilinear function model, as interpolation model in the first place. So in this sense, we've achieved a very reliable link now between the domain and the codomain in this density plot. And here, just for comparison, we have the continuous scatter plot over here, discrete scatter plot over here, same type of input samples, very different results. And you have all these sampling artifacts on the right-hand side, they're completely gone in the continuous scatter plot over here. But since this is a scatter plot, you can do all the usual tricks, how you can use scatter plots. For example, you can do brushing and linking. For example, you brush this area here in the scatter plot. You can highlight the certain areas here over on the right-hand side in the volume. And likewise, you can brush these lower values here in the scatter plot, and they correspond to this highlighted area over here. All right, so this kind of wraps up the technical parts that I wanted to present. But a very big, important piece is that evaluation is a key thing that we have to consider in visualization research in general. And of course, this also plays a big role in our case of visualizations of multidimensional data. And therefore, I'd like to briefly just go into one study that we did on multidimensional visualization. And if you want to look up the details, here's the corresponding paper. So in this paper or study, we looked into scatter plots, or rather collections of scatter plots, in order to be able to show more than 2 data dimensions. And we also looked into parallel coordinates. And here's a quick overview of the key elements that we used in the study. So first, it was meant as a comparative evaluation, comparing between scatter plots and parallel coordinates. And we used within subjects design, we had 24 participants. And the task was to find the closest point to a given reference point in multidimensional space. 2 typical stimuli of this you find here on the right-hand side. And we recorded response times and accuracy for just doing traditional task performance analysis. But on top of that, the interesting thing is we also recorded eye tracking data here with the Tobii T60XL system. And we did a systematic study of several factors. One of the most interesting factors was the number of data dimensions shown in the plots. And I would like to highlight now a few of the results that we obtained in our study. And I'd like to start with the more traditional approach, that's task performance results. And the left image here just summarizes the statistical comparisons. As background information, they're all based on the Kruskal-Wallis test in this case. And the yellow background here indicates the comparisons with respect to timings, and the red ones here for accuracy. And whenever there's a plus or minus sign, in those cases, we found significant differences. The interesting thing is the center image here. And these, the plots here, or the diagram shows response times. We have scatter plots, or CC, Cartesian coordinates in short, and they are shown in orange color. And in blue color, we have the parallel coordinates, or PC in short. And what you see here is that we have a varying dimensionality. And the first, of course, striking example or finding is that we have a low response time, very low response time for the scatter plot in 2 dimensions, but it increases rapidly here. So the winner is clearly the scatter plot if you have 2 data dimensions, but if you go to higher and higher dimensionality, actually the parallel coordinates take over and they are faster. If you look at accuracy, the differences aren't that pronounced. So the interesting thing here, at least in our study, was to look at the speed, how fast participants could perform the tasks. But these are only some of the results that we found for task performance. But for us, the interesting thing is that we also wanted to find out a little bit more how we work with visualizations. And because the previous results were interesting, but not very surprising, it's also cool to see that from eye tracking, actually we arrived at some results that were not expected in the first place. So we used eye tracking to essentially identify different visual scanning strategies. And for the scatter plots or Cartesian coordinates, the participants mostly ignored the axes. So if you look at the heat map, you see that they're centered, or the attention is kind of concentrated on the data points here. And you also see that in the quantitative data here in the table, that we have very low numbers for fixations in the area of the axes. Now, in contrast, for the parallel coordinates, we have a very different observation. So the heat map already shows that a lot of attention is really pointed towards the parallel coordinates axes. And that gets even more pronounced if you just look at the quantitative data that tells us that for parallel coordinates, most of our attention is actually guided towards the axes. And that's something that we didn't expect before we did the study. In fact, this gives maybe some hints how you could work with variants of designs for parallel coordinates. Since a lot of the tasks can be done and are being done by just looking at the axis, you essentially could play around with the design space between the axes and do something there. In fact, some of the techniques that do bundling of parallel coordinates do that already. They deform the parallel coordinates axes, the parallel coordinates polylines between the axes in the interior part and just keep kind of the original shape around the original data axis. And they work quite well. And maybe that's some reason here, because we as participants or users mostly look at the data axis and the area around the data axis to read off data values and to interpret the parallel coordinates. Again, this is one of the findings that we did or we arrived at. There are more in the paper, but this was one of the interesting ones that was surprising to us. More as an outlook, you can do more with eye tracking than just using it for evaluation purposes. Here's very recent work where we used gaze data that's being recorded while you're working with a visual analysis system, and you can use this gaze data to come up with implicit control of the visualization system. Here, in this sense, it's a visualization recommendation. In this specific case, we looked at the data analysis using scatter plots and splots, and then we recorded eye gaze data, and from that we could infer what was the interest of the user. So what clusters did the user look at? And then we looked at the respective data values, and we could recommend similar kind of data behaviors in other views, or just the opposite. So in this sense, the combination of gaze data for attention modeling, plus some kind of quality metrics for similarity of visualizations allowed us to do some recommendations for next steps. All right. I talked about quite some things on an overview level, also in some depth, but there are also a lot of pieces that I had to completely leave out. So as discussed, there's already this interesting link between domain and codomain. We've seen some aspects of that, but you can do much more in this direction. And for example, this whole concept of visual parameter space analysis exactly deals with this topic in much more detail. The other thing that I couldn't have touched really is uncertainty visualization. This is, of course, a very important topic in many areas of visualization. Also, of course, in multidimensional visualization, and just had not enough time to look into that. But just as an outlook, here's a typical example of a technique that is useful for multidimensional data analysis and that can be made aware of uncertainty. So this is an uncertainty-aware version of PCA. And if you have completely certain data values like these points, you might get these axes from uncertainty from the PCA. If you now kind of include some additional uncertainty to the data points, they get bigger and bigger. You see that these axes of the projection, they keep on turning. So there's an impact, even if the location of the data points doesn't change, or if they don't change, you have an impact on the projection, how the projection looks after PCA if you model it correctly. This is just one example. There's much more you can do in uncertainty-related topics, uncertainty quantification and visual mapping in multidimensional data visualization. All right. With this, let me come to a brief summary. So what we've seen is that I've discussed several of the visualization strategies, and I should again say that I used my own perspective to categorize these strategies. And then we've looked at many approaches, and many of them work actually best in combination, just to reduce the individual shortcomings and kind of combine best of many worlds. I also talked a little bit about features and how they can be extracted and used in the visualization techniques to improve them. So for example, the local correlation played a big role in my talk. And we've also looked into sampling and the relationship between domain, codomain, and the function. And finally, I touched on some of the aspects of evaluating multidimensional visualization. And here I also made the point that eye tracking can bring additional information on top of the traditional task performance measures, both for the evaluation, but later on even for interactive recommender systems. All right. Let me briefly highlight some possible direction of interesting future research. And as already indicated, there's quite some value to uncertainty visualization. And this could also be used to improve techniques in terms of trustworthiness for multidimensional visualization, make them more reliable. We should also take care of including characteristics of the spaces, for example, of the codomain and the domain likewise. And many of the existing techniques treat all the problems on a very generic level. And I think we can do better there if we include some specific knowledge about how the spaces are organized. I also think that there is future potential for better design of pattern recognition and feature extraction techniques specifically for multidimensional data visualization. And of course, we briefly touched on the big topic of evaluation. And of course, I think especially this problem of multidimensional analysis links very nicely to the hot topic of machine learning, data analysis, integration with ML, explainable AI, and so on. And finally, I think the whole thing should also reach out to improved visualization literacy, because at the end, we want to make advanced visualizations accessible to a broad audience. All right. I should acknowledge many people that worked together on these different projects involved. So without them, the whole research wouldn't have been possible. So a lot of thanks to my collaborators. I also would like to thank funding agencies, especially DFG, for their ongoing support, especially in this context of the SFB TRR 161. And just for completeness, here are some the credits, image credits for the images that I've used. And with this, I'm at the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Well, thanks a lot for the nice talk and very well prepared slides. Thanks, Daniel. So it's Q&A session now. So you can send me your questions. While I'm waiting for questions, I'll ask 2 questions of my own. So you mentioned the future directions of multidimensional data analysis, visual analysis. We have done the local PCA and correlation stuff. What else do you think is useful in the local analysis?
In the local, I'm not so sure. I think what are useful patterns is, I think, thinking about the whole area of clustering. Of course, there's been a lot of work in clustering, but I think even more integration of clustering aspects in as a basis for kind of data pre-processing could play a role. I think this might go into this whole area of, let's say, subspace analysis, that you pick the right subspaces. You can dig into those subspaces more carefully. I think that could be something where on a more generic level, there could be still a bit of work done. Although we have to admit that but say that there has been a lot of work in this area as well. But this is something I haven't touched here much, only very briefly when I talked about the gaze spirals. Everything beyond, if you say you want to look at local features, I think the best hope is, and that's what I indicated, by looking into an understanding of the spaces themselves and the structure of the spaces. Because the techniques that I presented and many of our colleagues are doing are very generic. So you view the space U and V, how I call them, the domain and codomain, you just take them as Cartesian space. You completely ignore what kind of data is sitting there. You might think of something like metrics if you do clustering, but that's most of end of the story. So you don't know anything about, let's say, geometric characteristics that might be imposed on a space. There are notable differences if you look at specific applications in CSIG-VIS. If you say, well, your space is not just 3 data dimensions, but it might be a vector in flow visualization, then there has been some work and specific work, and all the flow visualization features take that into account. But I think that's a way, but it makes the whole thing, of course, much more application specific. If you include this kind of knowledge about either the domain or the codomain, when you look essentially at multi-field data, I think you would probably coin it multi-field data in our usual language if you want to do that. But coming back essentially to your original question, I think it's really hard to think of much more on a local area. Of course, you could do a little bit more like higher order techniques. It's not just linear, but maybe some other local fittings that might play a role there. But I think it wouldn't be a substantial improvement.
Okay. So it seems to be a difficult problem here.
Yeah.
Do you think topology will help in the case of multidimensional visualization? For example, how many branches of features, something like that?
I could very well see that, yeah. But again, I think that might depend a little bit more on how the data is structured. I could see certain data sets where you could see these kind of branches. You could just look at this example of the scatter plot, like the continuous scatter plot that I showed. You could try to do something like image analysis that would go more into this direction of skagnostics, that you like to see features in a visual representation of the data. So you don't look at the data set itself or the original representation of the data set, but only after it's being or was visualized, and then try to extract certain features. So Technostics does that, and I could see very well, because on image processing and so on, topology methods gave some good results for certain problem settings. I could see them working there as well, that you see maybe connected components, certain main features. You could also look into persistence for filtering away that only important features in the visualization are kept. So things like those I could see very well working.
Okay.
And probably if you're interested, it becomes if the projection or the representation is not 2D, because we're very good at just staring at a 2D image, and we're good in analyzing that as humans. But let's say if you do a dimensionality reduction that reduces to 5D or 6D, it's really hard to deal with that. And I think in this case, the topology could actually be of quite some help.
Okay. So I have one question from the audience. Is so you know that high dimensional space is sparse. But we did this TSNE and PCA projection for the neighborhood. Is that really meaningful?
High dimensional space is sparse. It depends really what the data is that we're looking at. So for most of our examples, even if let's say the original space was a little bit higher dimensionality, the actual space where we, for example, applied parallel coordinates on was like 3-dimensional, or not very high dimensional. So we did kind of some projection beforehand, and in this representation, the data set was not sparse anymore. And but I think it's a general comment it's a very valid comment. We have to be careful what kind of dimensionality reduction technique in general you apply if you have very high dimensional data. That's why I think many people do something a little bit more robust than TSNE if you come from very high dimensional data for your first step, and then you work in a kind of lower dimensional space, but more than 2D, let's say 5D or something, where the sparsity isn't such a big problem. And then you can play our usual tricks that I applied here. So in short, I think it's a very valid comment, and many of the visualization techniques really don't work for very high dimensional data. You always have to reduce it first in the first place, maybe not to 2D, but something that's reasonable, and then work from there on.
Okay, thanks. I think that's all the questions we have here. And thanks again for your time, and really nice talk, Daniel. Yeah, so I will.
Thank you from my side. Thanks for having me at your presentation series.
Thank you. Yeah, I will do an advertisement for the next next session, or well, next time. It will be Ivan Viola. So I will have to share my screen, Daniel. And okay. So next time we will have Ivan Viola from King Abdullah University of Science and Technology. And the title is Volume Visualization for Cryo-Electron Tomography. Okay, so it will be June the 2nd, and same time, 7 p.m. to 8:30. Okay, so I think that will close our forum today. And thanks again for your talk, and thanks everyone for coming. Okay.
Thank you. Goodbye.